Leaden clouds hung heavily over the endless Novgorod forests, merging with the horizon into a single gray canvas, portending nothing but endless cold. The temperature plummeted, crossing the -40 degrees mark, turning nature itself into a merciless adversary. In this icy wilderness, where the sound of trees cracking from the frost resembled rifle shots, a drama unfolded, the scale of which contemporaries did not immediately grasp. Hundreds of thousands of people found themselves drawn into a gigantic knot of contradictions, ambitions, and strategic miscalculations amidst the impassable swamps and ravines of the Valdai Hills. For the freezing soldiers, peering into the white gloom, this corner of the earth became the center of the universe. The air suddenly filled with a low, vibrating hum, the sound of heavy aircraft engines cutting through the blizzard. This sound gave some hope for the continuation of the struggle, while in others it instilled a dull annoyance and the realization that the perfect plan had cracked. It was the winter of 1942. It was here, in the area of an inconspicuous settlement whose name would soon become a household word in staff academies around the world, that an illusion capable of turning the tide of world history was forged. This was a story of how a grand design turned into the greatest oversight, and how the tactical triumph of one side laid the foundation for its own future crushing collapse. The prerequisites for this large-scale clash were formed in an atmosphere of incredible strategic tension and suddenly erupted euphoria. Just a few months before the events described, it seemed that the fate of the eastern continent was sealed. However, the unprecedented defense of the capital and the subsequent powerful counteroffensive overturned all calculations. A wave of unprecedented enthusiasm swept through headquarters at all levels. The High Command, intoxicated by the first significant successes, demanded the immediate development of the initiative. There arose a firm belief that the enemy was finally broken, that its logistical chains were destroyed, and its morale undermined by endless retreat across snow-covered expanses. In this atmosphere of categorical directives and ambitious plans, the concept of deep enveloping strikes was born. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command ordered not just to push back the enemy, but to encircle and completely liquidate its large formations. On the northwestern vector of this colossal front, the target was a powerful enemy grouping that had deeply wedged itself into the defense. The geography of these places seemed to be created to complicate the life of any attacking army. The area abounded with dense, impenetrable forest tracts, vast peat bogs that even in severe frosts posed a danger, and a complete lack of a developed road network. The movement of huge masses of people and equipment was possible only along rare dirt tracks, which instantly turned into icy rinks or impassable snow trenches. In these extreme conditions, armies began their slow but relentless movement towards each other, striving to close the steel pincers around the enemy forces. In early February, the ring closed. The trap, carefully set on staff maps, snapped shut in reality. The external outline of the unfolding tragedy looked like an unconditional triumph of military art. Inside a huge pocket, with an area of approximately 3,000 square kilometers, about 100,000 soldiers and officers from 6 different divisions found themselves trapped. According to all canons of classical strategy, an army cut off from its supply bases, deprived of the ability to receive ammunition and provisions, is doomed to a quick capitulation. The command was anticipating a grandiose success, expecting the exhausted enemy to lay down their arms within a few weeks. However, the real state of affairs in the snow-covered positions radically differed from optimistic forecasts. The encircled formations did not falter or break into disorganized crowds. On the contrary, realizing their position, they instantly regrouped, organizing a rigid, circular defense. Every even slightly suitable village, every height, was turned into a fortified bastion. The ground, frozen 1.5 meters deep, yielded only to explosives, but the men gnawed into it, creating a complex system of trenches and shelters. The line of contact froze, turning into a steel-bristling perimeter. And it was at this moment, when it seemed that time was working exclusively against the besieged, that the enemy took a step that overturned all notions of logistics. The sky over the cauldron filled with the roar of transport aircraft. An air artery began to function, unprecedented in its scale and audacity of design. The internal layer of this confrontation revealed the deepest psychological drama. For the commanders of the operation, this period became a time of agonizing decisions and the realization of the limits of human capabilities. Soviet generals were under colossal pressure from Moscow. Every report, every telephone conversation via direct line was accompanied by an icy demand: accelerate the liquidation, finish off the group immediately, at any cost. In these conditions, staff work turned into a race against time, where not only military careers but also the very lives of the leaders were at stake. The fear of the wrath of the higher leadership sometimes overshadowed sober calculation. Commanders on the ground saw how their regiments melted away in fruitless attacks on fortified villages, how soldiers, exhausted by many kilometers of marches knee-deep in snow, fell asleep on the go and never woke up again. But the flywheel of the offensive continued to turn, demanding more and more sacrifices in the name of an early report of victory. Interaction between divisions collapsed under the weight of incompetent liaison officers and chaos in control. Tanks, which were supposed to be the decisive argument, turned into immobile iron coffins in peat lowlands, never firing a single shot at the enemy. Inside the ring itself, the situation was mirrored, but colored in different tones. German officers, such as Walter von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt, faced a dilemma capable of breaking even the strongest-willed person. On the one hand, a strict order to hold positions to the last cartridge. On the other hand, 100,000-strong collective of people for whom they were responsible. The psychological state of the encircled balanced on the verge between apathy and a fierce desire to survive. Soldiers, accustomed to the swift victories of the summer of 1941, now realized themselves to be hostages of a situation they could not control. Every day of waiting turned into a battle with hunger and frostbite. A simple piece of bread or a sip of hot ersatz coffee became more important than any ideological slogans. It was here, in the frozen dugouts near Demyansk, that the specific feeling of comradeship of the doomed was born, which would later become a leitmotif of many frontline memoirs. The belief that the mainland had not forgotten them was maintained only by the monotonous rhythm of arriving aircraft. But every such flight was a gamble with death. Transport pilots, often with minimal combat experience, had to land their overloaded machines on improvised icy strips under anti-aircraft fire. This conflict exposed a fundamental difference in the perception of the value of human resources versus technological superiority. For one side, a human was merely a unit in an endless stream, intended to break resistance with sheer mass and pressure. For the other, a tool whose functionality depended on the seamless operation of a highly complex logistical mechanism. The ideological clash centered on the question: Could steel will and discipline overcome the objective laws of geography and supply? The Soviet side believed that with sufficient self-sacrifice, any obstacles would fall. The enemy, however, gambled everything, believing in the power of their engines and the precision of their aviation quartermaster's calculations. It was a battle of two utopias. One side dreamed of an instantaneous and crushing encirclement that would decide the outcome of the entire northern campaign. The other, of creating an impregnable fortress in the air, capable of sustaining a huge army against all laws of physics. The realization that the air bridge not only existed, but effectively sustained the viability of an entire army, became a moment of fundamental transformation in the entire course of the operation. Hopes that hunger and ammunition depletion would do the work for the advancing forces dissolved in the frosty air. It became crystal clear that physical encirclement alone did not mean a final end if the enemy maintained a supply channel. An urgent paradigm shift was required, a redirection of efforts to destroy landing sites within the cauldron, and a complete blockade of air routes. However, the enormous military machine possessed too much inertia. The restructuring of tactics proceeded agonizingly slowly. Coordination between ground forces and aviation remained at an extremely low level. Fighters often patrolled the sky during hours when enemy transports were not flying, and anti-aircraft crews lacked sufficient shells to organize a dense barrage. Meanwhile, the enemy outside the ring was not idle. Concentrating strike reserves, in the spring of 1942, they launched an operation to break the blockade from the outside. This was a period of incredible strain on both sides. The spring thaw turned roads into impassable quagmires. Equipment sank in the mud. Men waded waist-deep in icy water under continuous fire. At the cost of colossal efforts, the enemy managed to punch through a narrow corridor only 6 to 8 kilometers wide, connecting the encircled grouping with the main forces. The trap transformed into a jug with a narrow neck, named the Ramushevo Corridor. This narrow passage became the site of one of the fiercest and most protracted battles of the war. The ground here was so churned by shells that the landscape changed daily. The climax of this protracted drama did not come in the form of a grand final assault, but in the form of a cold, methodical calculation. For long months, desperate, bloody attempts were made to cut this thin artery of life, striving to snap the lid shut again. But each time the attacks faltered before the echeloned defense. The denouement came in early 1943. A change in the global strategic situation in the southern directions forced the Reich leadership to reconsider its priorities. Fearing that a new catastrophe, similar to the one that had already begun to unfold on the Volga, might repeat itself here, a decision was made for a covert, systematic abandonment of the salient. This evacuation operation, codenamed Zethan, became a model of tactical withdrawal. Under the cover of rearguard screens and complex camouflage measures, within a few weeks, the enemy withdrew almost its entire contingent from the former trap. When the Soviet divisions finally broke into the territory of the salient, they found only abandoned fortifications and an oppressive emptiness. The enormous grouping, which was supposed to be the main trophy of the entire winter campaign, simply vanished, leaving the advancing forces with nothing but control over a scorched territory. The historical resonance of these events turned out to be paradoxical and deeply tragic. Each side drew its own lessons from this months-long epic, which ultimately led to massive consequences. The information machine worked flawlessly, transforming the occupation of deserted territories into a resounding victory in the eyes of the public. Official reports emphasized the liberation of hundreds of settlements, while the fact of the successful escape of a 100,000-strong enemy army was neatly omitted. The process of acknowledging their own mistakes, the inability to concentrate forces, poor coordination of headquarters, and inflexible command structures was difficult and cost an enormous number of lives in subsequent operations. A unique window of opportunity was missed when, with one decisive blow, the entire northern flank of the front could have been collapsed. But the most insidious trap snapped shut for the opposing side. The undeniable tactical success of the air supply at Demyansk laid the foundation for a fatal strategic illusion. The highest leadership of the Reich became convinced of the absolute omnipotence of its transport aviation. The successful experience of rescuing the army in the Novgorod forests became the main argument at that fateful moment when, a few months later, a grouping 3 times larger than the Demyansk one found itself encircled in the steppes near Stalingrad. Relying on the Demyansk precedent, the commander of the Air Force gave a frivolous promise to repeat this feat of logistics on a much larger scale. This decision, based on misinterpreted experience, led to the greatest catastrophe that changed the course of the entire war. Technological arrogance and the belief that a miracle could be mass-produced blinded those who made the decisions. They forgot that the weather over the Volga and the power of anti-aircraft defenses at that moment no longer allowed the liberties permissible in the Novgorod forests. The irony of history is that the tactical luck at Demyansk became the direct cause of the strategic collapse in the south. Today, when the noise of those battles remains only in archives and on the pages of memoirs, the snow-covered forests of the Valdai Hills remain silent. Trees have grown again in the place of scorched wastelands, hiding the traces of trenches and craters under the soft cover of time. But the echo of those events continues to sound as an eternal warning. This story is not about simple categories of winning or losing. It is about how grandiose illusions can blind, how the fear of responsibility in headquarters leads to catastrophes at the front, and how tactical success, if its causes are misunderstood, can become a harbinger of complete crushing. True wisdom lies not in the ability to beautifully report on occupied lines, but in the courage to acknowledge miscalculations while they can still be corrected. The roar of transport planes in the cold February sky of 1942 became not only a sound of hope for some, but also a deferred sentence for millions of others. History repeatedly reminds us that it never forgives unlearned lessons, arrogance, and attempts to replace reality with convenient reports. Concluding this journey along the snowy roads of the past, we return to the same forest where we began, the same leaden clouds, the same icy silence. But now we understand what lay hidden behind that silence. We see behind it not merely the movement of armies, but a clash of wills, ambitions, and fatal delusions. What began as a local encirclement operation became a bifurcation point for all of world history. And when we next hear tales of great victories or crushing defeats, it is worth remembering these forests, where in the snows of Valdai, the fate of entire continents was forged, where the price of error was measured not only in territories, but also in a future that could have unfolded according to an entirely different scenario. This memory is our main tool against repeating old mistakes under new names.